This is the E-Mag disassembly and reassembly video. Your E-Mag represents the flagship line of Airgun Design's products. It has electronic controlled system in the grip, rechargeable battery pack, removable barrel, and the famous RT fast recharge valve. We're going to go through the disassembly and the reassembly of this gun today and talk about it. First of all, the barrel comes out with a quick pull of the twist lock. It has two nubbins in these barrels for better ball control. We highly recommend this if you use the warp feed with any of the AGD products. The E-Mag is Airgun Design's first electronic gun. It features a computer system in the grip frame with LED display, nickel metal hydride battery pack in the front, which is removable, and one of the most important features of this gun is a switch to switch between mechanical mode with a long trigger pull and electric mode with a short trigger pull. We're going to go through some different disassembly steps of this today so you can see the basics of how the gun is put together, and we'll talk about some of its features. First of all, the battery pack can be removed by unscrewing the front field strip screw. This field strip screw is identical to the one that holds the valve system in the back. The battery slides off of a dovetail mount. You can see two contacts for the positive and negative terminals on the inside. The battery pack can be disassembled by the two screws in the bottom. It's important not to let the contacts contact themselves when you're disassembling the battery pack. This is the nickel metal hydride battery pack with the contacts on the top. This O-ring acts as a spacer in the bottom of the battery pack to push the contacts up against the top portion of the battery housing. So don't forget this when you put it back together. Simply slides in. Top on. Put the O-ring in. And your battery pack is back together. Go. You'll notice that there's two contacts in the frame. One is ground, one is positive, and it's been insulated. Working our way back through the gun, we'll take off the sight rail real quick. Now we have access to the full side of the main body. What we can do now is unscrew the field strip screw. Remove the valve assembly. Remove the bolt. To further disassemble the valve, we can take apart the on-off. The E-Mag has a different on-off assembly than standard Auto-Mags. It has a black quad O-ring on the top. This is not your standard urethane O-ring, and this is special only to the E-Mag. Also, it has a silver on-off top. As you can see here, it's not brass. It has a brass bottom as normal, but this is also a custom part only for the E-Mag. So if you replace this part, make sure you call AGD and get the proper parts. Twisting the valve body apart, we have a couple of small parts in here, which are the regulator valve. There are several small parts on this valve. If you find any of these broken, call AGD for replacements. There's several O-rings. It's not the type of thing you want to take apart. You should just clean it and oil it and reassemble it. Also, this is the regulator seat O-ring here. This can be replaced if you have problems with velocity. Nothing else is user serviceable except for what's inside the power tube tip. And to unscrew that, you need a coin. This is the power tube tip. Inside is the power tube spacer. Comes out next. The spacer has numbers on it that determine how long the spacer is. If you have leaking out the barrel, this is the thing to replace. Or the power tube O-ring, which is down inside here. The power tube O-ring comes in the parts kit. So any leakage that you have down the barrel should replace the power tube O-ring or adjust your spacer length. Now the main body is completely empty. This is a power feed main body. This is called a hopper right because the hopper sits on the right side of the gun. We also sell them in hopper left, vertical feed, as well as a special warp feed body. Warp feed bodies have a very short feed tube pointing down, and the power feed plug goes in the top. So to remove the main body, we unscrew the front frame screw. Now the body comes off, front frame screw slides out, and we're left with a rail and the lower grip frame. To take the rail off, we unscrew the sear pin. And the rail should slide straight off. So now we're left with the grip frame assembly with the sear sticking out. Next, we can unscrew the grip frame and we can get underneath into the area of the electronics. The E-Mag has an internal circuit board with LED display. The LED lights up so you can see it in the darkness. There are 3 jumpers on the board where things plug into. The solenoid is soldered to the board. The main wires here in the center. These wires right here hook up the sensor for the trigger. This jumper right here that comes installed in the E-Mag is for accessing your additional modes, your 3-shot burst modes. If you remove this jumper, you can only go into semi-auto mode. This is for tournament use. There is an additional plug up in the front. It's a 2-pin plug. That is for the connection to the warp feed, so you can send a signal to the warp feed to feed. So there are 3 plugs. The top one is for the warp feed. The middle one is for your Hall effect sensor behind the trigger. The lower one is for programming, which is not available right now, as well as the jumper for non-tournament use. So now we will take out the sear. To take out the sear, you just need to remove the C-clip on the top of the solenoid. Grab it with the pliers, pull it out. C-clip. Slide the sear assembly up and out. And you're good. Now you have left the trigger mechanism and the electronics. We take off the other side of the grip frame. We have a screw that holds the solenoid in place. Take that out. Now the solenoid is able to slide out the front. We'll unplug the Hall effect sensor. Now we can unscrew the circuit board. The circuit board has a single screw in the bottom of it here that also acts as the ground for the circuit board, so it's important that it's tight at all times. Single screw. Circuit board can come out now, except for the power lead, which we will not disconnect on the top. So the power lead comes down through the back, comes into the circuit board, and if you were to disconnect all of that, you could see that the whole thing would come out. This is not something that would be normally user serviceable. Solenoid also slides out, but this should never need to be replaced. Again, do not use Loctite on this screw. It will prevent good contact. We'll put this back together. If you should take this apart, make sure that the two switches here have the push buttons in the back of the grip frame installed, and they do not catch on the switches when you put the system back together. Sometimes we'll put a piece of Scotch tape across the back there to hold them in. There are no user serviceable parts on the circuit board. If you have problems with it, please call Airgun Designs. The Hall effect sensor, we'll take it apart here just so you can see it. The Hall effect sensor is a transistor that is sandwiched between two pieces of plastic behind the grip, behind the trigger. Once you unscrew the mounting screw, you can push it out from behind the grip frame. This is the top part. I unthread the wiring for the Hall effect harness now. This is the bottom part of the Hall effects mount. And we're sliding the transistor assembly out the back. Well, maybe we're going to come out the front. This is a small transistor. There are no moving parts in this. It senses magnetism against one face of the transistor, and this is what actuates the gun. Solenoid's hanging out here, so what we'll do is we'll put it back in and screw it down into place to hold it. So now one of the more important things we want to talk about is adjusting your trigger. as you can see, you have a long trigger pull here. This is for the mechanical actuation of the gun. And in E mode, you have a much shorter trigger pull. There are several adjustments that can be made to the E-Mag, and this is one of the best things about the electronic side of the gun. Up in the top, there is a small set screw inside the shaft that connects the lever. You can see it right there. If we put the proper size Allen wrench in there, you can adjust this. You can adjust the stroke when it's in E mode. So now you can see that there's some visible movement of the trigger. If I screw this in, I can adjust it till there's absolutely zero movement of the trigger. There's no movement now. Let's adjust. One of the things you need to be careful of when you're adjusting this is that the lever switch is in the proper position. It's moved a little bit on me here. Okay, we have a very slight amount of movement there. I can adjust it all the way to zero. Now there's no movement. And if I unscrew it about half a turn, that gives me about 1/2 millimeter of trigger throw. And the way we measure that 1/2 millimeter is we measure it from the inside of the top finger loop to the front of the trigger guard. So we would put a calipers in here, pull it, and see how far it moves. So once you've adjusted that, you've adjusted the stroke of your trigger in the E mode. It cannot be adjusted much below about 1/3 of a millimeter due to the hysteresis in the Hall effect sensor. The other thing that's adjustable is the strength of the trigger, the return spring, so to speak. Inside the top of the grip frame are a stack of very strong magnets. These magnets are pulling against another magnet that's in the top of the trigger, right here. So when the magnets are removed right now, you can see that the trigger is floppy. It has no return pull at all. When we put these magnets in, it has a return spring, so to speak. Now the way you adjust this is you can put in fewer magnets or more magnets depending on how you like your trigger. So with one magnet it can be lighter, with two magnets it can be a little stiffer, and you can go up to 4 magnets inside your trigger frame. Most people like it somewhere between 2 and 3 magnets. So if you want to barely feel the trigger, go with fewer magnets. If you want to feel a stronger, stiffer trigger, go with more magnets. So those are your 2 adjustments. This has now adjusted your return spring, so to speak, and your stroke in E mode. Mechanical mode is not affected by this. It goes the full stroke to the stops in the frame. So the next thing you need to do is adjust where the sensor picks up the magnet. There's a magnet inside the trigger which is adjusted by putting in a wrench and twisting this in and out. So as we rotate this, the magnet will move in and out toward or away from the sensor buried in the trigger frame. So first thing we'll do is we'll put the sensor back in. Again, this lower piece here with a little cutout in it drops in. It only goes one way. Next we'll feed in the sensor. The sensor has a particular orientation to work right. You'll see it's bent 90 degrees. The wiring should drop down into the slot inside the plastic parts and also in the slot in the back of the grip frame here. So you can see that the sensor is now sitting square into the lower slot of the plastic holder. Top piece goes in on top. Now you've got the sensor sandwiched and isolated. we put in the mounting screw, if I can find the right. Tighten that up. Then I'm going to run the wires and plug in the Hall effect harness to the middle jumper with the 3 pins. Next we'll put the battery back on so we can test and see if our trigger system's working. Now after the initial log on of the chip, which shows us your rev number, so in order to adjust the trigger point of your trigger, now that you've got the stroke adjusted, you need to use a small Allen wrench that goes inside the front of the trigger here. And what this does is as you screw this in and out, it adjusts the magnet inside the trigger closer or farther from the sensor inside the grip frame. The way you can tell you're activating your trigger without having air on the gun is if you look down here, you'll see a little light flashing on and off. That light tells you that the gun is currently on and functional, and when you pull the trigger, the light will flash. So if I adjust my trigger out of range, too far one way or another, well, it does not flash. So right now the trigger is out of range. When I bring it back into range, you'll see it comes on. So what you need to do is adjust the trigger while it's in the E mode, not mechanical, but in E mode. Adjust the position of the magnet using the Allen wrench until it gets into range. Then you should air the gun up, fire the gun, and make sure that the fire point is toward the back end of the trigger stroke. And you want to leave a little space after the fire point so the trigger continues to move through the fire point. So fairly simple, but should get you a very fine adjustment. Once you adjust it, it should stay there. Since there are no moving parts, there's nothing to change. That gets you all the adjustments necessary for the E mode of your gun. The trigger rod lengths are adjusted at the factory and should not be messed around with. We have a delicate balance between the trigger rod length in mechanical mode and the rod on the solenoid for E mode. When the gun fires, there should be some travel after the fire point that the solenoid continues to pull the plunger down further. So at this point, we'll go ahead and reassemble the gun. Take off the battery. In order to save your battery power, we have a small yellow pin that goes inside the hole on the back side of the battery here, and this will turn the gun off. As you can see, there's no longer any power going to the gun. So do not use this as an on-off switch. What you should always use is the safety in the top of the gun to make sure the gun will not fire. Because it is both an electrical and a mechanical gun, it's important to use the sear blocking safety at all times. So once you pull the pin back out, you'll see your version number will light up once again. So we'll disconnect the battery before we put the rest of the gun back together. First thing we'll do is slide in the sear, and the sear has to be rocked forward and then pulled into position, and you can see the trigger rod coming out just behind the trigger, so we're in good shape there. The next thing we need to do is put the C-clip back onto the solenoid. That can just be pushed on finger tight. Then we'll go ahead and put on the rear grip. Get it all lined up here. Now on this side, we'll make sure the display is pushed all the way in. Want to make sure that your ground screw is tight, that everything is sitting properly in the board. Your actuator buttons are functioning and you can feel the click in the switch. And we're looking pretty good here. Solenoid moves freely, so we're looking fine there. So before we put this side of the rubber grip on, we'll put on the rail. And we're going to do this so we can line everything up here. This allows us some ability to push the sear rod so we can line up the sear pin. Okay, now we have the sear in place. It's rocking freely, so we're looking good. Manual mode is looking good. Next, we'll put on the main body. And we'll put in the front frame screw. We'll tighten up the front frame screw snug. Now we're looking good there. E-mode's working. Everything is looking smooth. We'll set this down a minute and we'll go to our power tube O-ring, power tube spacer, power tube tip. Then we'll put in the on-off assembly, again remembering to put in the black quad O-ring. Good there. Then we'll put together the valve pin assembly. Slide that into the valve body. This piece contains the reg piston, not something you would normally need to mess with. Screw them together until the lines line up on the valve body. Drop the bolt on. Slide the assembly into the back of the body. You also want to tighten this down a little bit. Doesn't have to be too tight, just snug it up. Again, through the whole process, I'm checking to make sure that everything is moving smoothly. We're looking good there. Next, we put on the sight rail. We'll skip that for now. When you go to put on the other side of the grip, notice that there's a clear plastic LED window that can pop out of the grip here. Make sure that's in place. And there you have it, your E-Mag, fully functional, ready to go. For more information, please see airgundesigns.com, automags.org, or call us directly and get one of our techs at AGD.